Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. We say Jazakallah to you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Another day, another Donald Trump, yes, X'd. He's X'd this time. But this time, his X is saying he is threatening to impose a 100% tariff on the Brics group nations if they undercut the US dollar. The statement comes after the Brics summit was held in Kazan, Russia, where the countries discussed boosting the non-dollar transactions and strengthening local currencies. The Brics group has expanded significantly since its expansion in 2009 with countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and right here in Africa, Ethiopia. Now, at the Kazan summit, there was a joint declaration encouraging the strengthening of correspondent banking networks within the Brics and enabling settlements in local currencies in line with the Brics cross-border payment initiatives. What does that mean? Is Donald Trump going to go ahead and go follow up his threat? Or is this just another empty tweet from him? Joining us now, I'd like to welcome Professor Patrick Bond, who is a distinguished professor and director for the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Bond, good day. Thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Assalamu alaikum for us. It's wonderful to be with you and your viewers.
No, alaikum salam. It's an absolute pleasure. Professor Bond, Donald Trump, what do we make of this tweet, given that it is Donald Trump after all? And, you know, it's a head scratcher when you have to decide whether he's actually going to follow up on this, or is this just a tweet to try and shake the markets up a little bit?
Well, for us, he's the world's greatest con man, but that doesn't mean that he won't be serious in punishing South African exports. And I would guess it won't be because of de-dollarization, but he will because of South Africa's support for Palestine and the genocide charges that are still rolling through the Hague courts and led to the United States having to jump around to try to defend Israel from the both International Criminal Court arrest warrants and from the genocide charges, plus the charges that would lead to trade sanctions if the United Nations General Assembly, following the ICJ in September, having said that Israel is an apartheid state illegally occupying the West Bank and therefore trade sanctions are appropriate. Let's say that those are the things that really upset Donald Trump because he is such an ultra-Zionist. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is very connected, and he doesn't like South Africa. He was very, very disparaging during his time in office, and he has the impression that there's a white farmer genocide, and he tweeted that during his time in power. Now, he didn't do much. The main thing he did during that period was to cut steel and aluminium exports that South Africa from Richards Bay, aluminium from the various steel foundries were sending to the US. And that's part of what the AGOA threat might be, that those would be cut further. However, I don't think de-dollarization will be a reason, simply because I don't think it's really happening. And I think the Kazan summit made clear it's only going to be just what you said, Brics pay. That is a little bit of interrelationships between Brics countries to have non-US dollar transactions, such as what China does with Russia or Russia does with India. Although there are going to be problems given that there's trade imbalances in those relations. And I don't think that's going to go very far, nor will there be any Brics currency, and nor will there be much in the way of dropping US dollar investment.
Prof, I want to touch on, of course, just the dollar in itself, because it is the currency that has really become the norm for the world. Now, de-dollarization, I mean, it's sort of simple. You take a magic wand and you wave it around and all of a sudden it's going to change. This is going to take quite a huge project in order for it to happen. But looking at the dollar in itself, looking at the multipolarization of the world, how much of it are we looking at that the US dollar in itself could be really moving away as the world's dominant currency? I say that because you look at the countries within Brics and they do wield a number of significant power in terms of resources in each of its countries. And I am going to touch on that in a little bit.
That's right. The main thing that the three most active currencies on the international financial exchanges are involved in is buying gold. Now, that would be China, Russia, and India. And that reflects, particularly for Russia, they don't want to be caught, as they were in 2022, with assets in dollars or euros that then get snatched, as we saw with the reaction by the US to the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Within days, not only was Russia kicked out of the SWIFT system and new financial sanctions imposed, such as no new loans, even the Brics New Development Bank agreed to those sanctions on March 4, 2022, for the reason that they look to the New York credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's, for approval. And they knew that if they carried anywhere close to what the Brics Bank, in a sense, owes to Russia, because Russia's a 20% owner of the Brics New Development Bank. In reality, they have closer to about 7% of their assets. But as those potentially would rise because the access to hard currency shrunk due to sanctions, well, the Brics New Development Bank, including South Africans, one the chair, one was a senior vice president, said, we are going to put sanctions on Russia. And the third, of course, was a seizure of about $600 billion worth of assets, about $350 billion from the state, and around 250 to 300 billion from the oligarchs. And that's one of the reasons that we began to hear a great deal, especially running up to August 2023 here in Johannesburg, in which the de-dollarization claim and let's call it a motif of what the Brics could do suddenly loomed large. But here in Johannesburg, unfortunately, the job of investigating how to do that was in the hands of some very conservative people. One of them, Sim Chabalala, head of Standard Bank, another Lesego Kganyago, our central bank governor, the Reserve Bank of South Africa, and then, of course, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. And they all said to the Brics leaders in August of last year, don't do it. We are too reliant upon the West. We're not going to. So we saw that in not just Johannesburg, but in Sao Paulo, the financial district of Brazil, in Mumbai, in India. We saw it even in Shanghai. And now even in his speech, Vladimir Putin at the Valdai meeting of what they have as a sort of economic club, he said the following, just 2 weeks ago, he said that we never wanted to abandon the dollar. And he said as well, as for a single Brics currency, quote, that's premature. We need to achieve greater integration of economies, increase the quality of economies to a certain compatible level. And that reflects that you have three major Brics that do lots of mineral exports, which are South Africa and Brazil, and Brazil doing petroleum and soy and agricultural goods, and Russia, which is oil and gas. So South Africa minerals. Those three, plus the new Brics that joined this year, which four of them, five if you include Saudi Arabia, major oil exporter, but the others, UAE, again, oil and gas, or Egypt, gas, or Iran, oil and gas, Ethiopia, much less a figure. And now we have 13 more, and the three Africans who are going to be the partners, not full members, also include major oil countries like Nigeria or Algeria, and the third is going to be an oil country very soon, Uganda. So you see what I'm saying is that there's an imbalance when you've got just export-oriented countries, and then you have two that are getting stronger with manufacturing. China, of course, the giant, the world's major one, but India as well. And I think that's going to be this permanent problem of imbalances in the economies that Putin was referring to. And regrettably, then, I don't think the Brics will be the leaders of what's desperately needed, a de-dollarization to lower the power of the United States Federal Reserve.
Prof. Bond, before we go to the break, I want to touch on AGOA. Of course, it's been renewed. We saw this year, of course, our Minister of Trade and Industry, Park Stow, leading this delegation to Washington, and the United States, of course, has gone through, 4 weeks of change with Donald Trump coming in as the president. Now, you've mentioned the stuff of Donald Trump and, of course, his then Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, if I stand to be corrected, making comments about South Africa, saying there's a quote-unquote white genocide that is happening, referring to the farmers here. And here in South Africa, we've got Ibrahim Rasool, who's going to Washington to serve as the ambassador. This supposed coming together between Washington and Pretoria is really going to be quite a frantic one, quite a static one. quite one that a lot of people are going to be looking with a magnifying glass, because all the cards, all the chips are now in the court of Donald Trump. And when you look at his rhetoric, it doesn't really look like he's the sort of president that wants to continue this AGOA for its extended period of time.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Donald Trump has a history of making racist remarks, and that includes about African countries as assholes. But also, his ideology, it's what we could call paleo-conservative, paleo meaning like the dinosaur age. And his role is a sort of protectionist and nativist and isolationist, as well as the xenophobia, the homophobia, the misogyny, all of the let's say, deviant ideologies of an old period when a guy like Trump could just rule the roost. We're going to be victims, and I think AGOA is one. We might also see him drop out of coming to Johannesburg 11 months from now for the G20. So the G20 is the biggest economies in the world that get together. They were just in Rio 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was let's say, an embarrassing period as Joe Biden was there. I was there personally and witnessed this, and nobody really knows what to do. Same with what just happened just 10 days ago, the destruction of United Nations climate negotiations in Baku, Azerbaijan, where the negotiators did sign a deal, but they walked away from commitments to phasing out fossil fuels. And the money that they came up with, by all accounts, except for our own environment minister, was way too little. So what I'm getting at is a destruction of a multilateral framework and the inability of the Brics to put a new multipolar system, partly because the dollar is so strong. And, I would go back, if you want a little quick memory, to 1934. It's when the dollar became the core of the world economy in Bretton Woods. And the reason was, in just 2 sentences, if you got gold and 2 countries had half the world's gold each, half was underneath us in Johannesburg. And Jan Smuts, the leader, said, let's do a deal with the US. They have the other half in Fort Knox.
Yes.
And that was to link dollar and gold. And in a way, white South Africa have a lot to answer for, because the, let me call it, destructiveness of US dollar power, the quantitative easing where they just print the dollar, the ability to put up world interest rates, which they did in 2022, bringing so many Africans into bankruptcy, countries like Ghana and Zambia and Ethiopia. All of these mean we desperately do need to de-dollarize. And it's a real shame that not only with Putin walking that back, also Xi Jinping in China authorizing a dollar bond on behalf of Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago, I fear we're moving in the other direction, re-dollarization.
After the break, I continue my conversation with Professor Patrick Bond. We're going to be talking about how the geopolitical perspective comes into frame. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to News in Focus. Professor Bond, thank you so much again for staying with us. Now, let's take the geopolitical perspective to this. Of course, you've got a trade war that is happening between the United States and China. You've got, of course, the US, who are, quote unquote, involved indirectly, supplying weapons to Ukraine in its war with Russia. And then, of course, here at home with South Africa, you've got the ICJ case you've mentioned, of course, earlier on, which has really irked the United States of America. How much of Donald Trump's ex, he mentioned yesterday, plays into this? The fact that he's looking at the Brics right now and really seeing something of an irritation to his part, and the fact that if, of course, these nations do get together and, of course, create a system where trade is done besides the dollar, this could, of course, affect the way the United States does trade from a global perspective.
Yes, I think that might be a conflict point at some point, but it's just not on the agenda for years and years because of this imbalance in economics, and the dollar hasn't really got to the point where it's so weak. It's still by far, regrettably, as I say, the dominant currency used in interbank transfers. The euro's up, in fact, crashing since 2022. The renminbi, the Chinese currency, is up to about 4%. But really, unfortunately, the world revolves around these Benjis, the $100 bill, and Benji, that Benjamin Franklin bill, what is considered for so many, whether it's in organized business or illicit activity, it's also not just a currency that has universal acceptability, but it's a store of value. And in addition, I think the U.S., let's say with its geopolitical might, 800 military, can always say, well, we'll invade whoever's after us. That was one of the arguments for why Iraq was invaded back in 2003. They were trying to get off the dollar. Saudi Arabia was playing with fire about a year and a half ago by going to a petro yuan, although, as I say, I think that may have ended. So the other geopolitics, aside from geoeconomic problems, again, the U.S. is just declining. Its working classes angry at losing jobs, the offshoring of manufacturing jobs especially. And that's why Trump was elected by a working class who he's very hostile to in his policies. So the others are, as you say, Ukraine. And I don't think Trump will give the same amount of funding that Biden did. Hence, last gasp effort by Zelensky to use U.S. weapons to fire deep into Russia. And that may create a lot of conflict in the next couple of 3 weeks or just before Trump takes over. When he does, I think the geopolitical tensions will shift. I think Trump's already signaling to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he's going to go ahead and basically genocide all of Gaza and push the Palestinians out of the West Bank. That seems to be one of the options that they're looking at. Their finance minister, Ben-Gvir, actually said, we'll take the 2 million people in Gaza, it was 2.2 million, probably 2 by now, with all the killing, and we'll get that down to 1 million. And so demanding that Egypt or Jordan take on Palestinian refugees or just killing many hundreds of thousands of more, it looks like it's a scenario. Now, the interesting thing is we do have a Brics statement from the Kazan summit in mid-October against Israel continuing the genocide, but it's not strong. The word genocide is not mentioned, in fact. And I always worry, for us, if you look at the rhetoric, it's fine, but the way 9 out of the 10 Brics, aside from Iran, are profiting from their relationships with Israel. South Africa being, believe it or not, the #1 coal exporter, Glencore and African Rainbow Minerals, run by Brics Motsepe, diamond trade, grapes, but also there are mercenaries. There are kids that come out of the Herzliya School or King David that go and fight in the IDF. They're not being prosecuted. We still have an embassy relationship, which the parliament just a year ago said, no, you have to cut that. But it's even worse. Russia's #2 coal supplier and has 1.3 million citizens in Israel. Remember, they left during the 1990s after. So they're in the IDF. They're as bad as any genocidaire there. And I can say that with every other Brics country except Iran, that they're very tied into Israel. I mean, India runs a major port at Haifa. So does Shanghai. They've got 2 privatized ports there. India sells arms. Saudi Arabia and Egypt and UAE were just called the blessing for Netanyahu when he spoke at the United Nations. Brazil supplies 9% of the oil. So the Brics aren't really an anti-Israeli force when it comes to the, let's say, monetary, financial, trade, investment relations. Regrettably, I think we're looking at enormous hypocrisy, and I just hope that President Ramaphosa, who happens to be the brother-in-law of the main coal beneficiary, Brics Motsepe, will end up under pressure to do something about that.
Prof. Bond, I want to touch on resources, and I mentioned that in the first part of this interview, where you've got all of these nations, and you've mentioned it. Of course, you've got India, who is the biggest supplier of rice, and of course they're dealing in dollars. You've got Saudi Arabia, who is of course one of the biggest output of oil production. They deal in dollars, and then added to that, Russia, of course, the United Arab Emirates can be put into that picture, and Iran also at the same time. It's a conversation I was having with a few family members yesterday when we were discussing how much does oil play a role in really the strengthening of the dollar. I asked this, of course, because OPEC makes these decisions when they have their meetings. So how much could the oil factor really swing in favor of Brics and this potential changing of another currency? Because, as they say, oil is king. And as long as fossil fuels is still around, and there's no really taking away of it, oil still has this big factor in terms of deciding the future and the outcome of the US dollar.
I know, and Donald Trump coming to power will make, let's say, the reliance upon oil and the slowness to shift to alternative energy sources far worse, he's promised to allow for offshore drilling and for drilling on federal lands in the United States, places like Alaska that have vast quantities of oil. And he's also promised to walk out of the United Nations climate negotiations, like we've just seen, effectively falling apart in any case, the next one being in Brazil next December in the Amazon. So we are seeing, let's say, a complete lack of responsibility to future generations. And you're right that oil in the 1970s, when OPEC formed and put on a cartel in 1973, that drove the price up. Secondly, when Iran had its liberation from the Shah, this US-supported dictator, and there was a lot of pressure on Iran, but they then temporarily were not supplying oil, and the price again soared. We've seen the price soar up to 2008 when there was a huge commodities boom, and we've seen it soar again when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, because there were a lot of the links, for example, the gas links between Russia and Europe that were cut, and sanctions put on Russian oil. So in all these ways, it becomes let's say, a very, very volatile part of the world economy, one that we have become so addicted to in our transport and in many countries' energy systems. And, of course, I think the future generations would look at us and say, we need that oil too. We don't need it to burn. We need it for the most valuable lubricants and synthetic materials, plastic in my laptop I'm talking to you on, or pharmaceutical products, or tarmac. All these things we would use the hydrocarbons in oil or coal for. And instead, our generations are just burning it and creating climate catastrophe. That, I think, might mean we'll see more of the pressure that we saw just before COVID of the youth. And there was a young Swedish woman, and she represents, in a way, the best of that tradition, saying, we've got to cut back on oil, but we've also got to cut back on genocide. And it's linking these two great movements of social activism around the world. They lost very badly, obviously, in the US. I mean, people who care about Palestine, people who care about the climate are absolutely writhing in pain because Donald Trump will make their lives and their allies' lives absolutely miserable. And I think South Africa has to therefore pick up the mantle, and work much harder. And even though we have what some call a government of neoliberal unity, a sort of big business-oriented government now with the Democratic Alliance, we have hardcore Zionists. The head of the DA, John Steenhuisen, says one side's genocide could be another side's freedom fighters. He actually said that, absolutely, genocide denialist. So if you've got that sort of government of unity and you can't really move as fast as you want on giving Palestinians direct support, at least we should be abiding by the United Nations General Assembly mandate in September, which South Africa voted for, not to trade with Israel, because such trade keeps, especially coal, which fuels about 18% of the energy system of Israel, fuels the not just genocide, but also the illegal occupations.
Prof. Unfortunately, we have come towards the end of our time. Thank you so much for joining us here on Using Focus on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
That's Professor Patrick Bonner, Professor and Director for the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. And of course, well, the question that we ask ourselves, is Donald Trump really going to follow up on this threat, or is it just another X that he puts out there and it's there for its entertainment? But we're yet to hear what the Brics nations have to say from a statement perspective, whether it's going to be a strong one or one where they will just leave and, of course, continue their job, as they would say, of trying to create a multipolar world. That's all we have for you here on Using Focus. From myself, Hilaal Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Stay beautiful, South Africa. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.